The wind swept fiercely through the narrow streets of Ashburn, carrying with it a chill that bit through even the warmest coats. The first heavy snow of winter blanketed the small town, transforming familiar rooftops and sidewalks into a glistening expanse of white. 15-year-old Jake Turner stood by the frost-covered window of his modest bedroom, watching the snow pile higher. The icy world outside felt as unrelenting as the challenges within his own home. The distant clatter of dishes and his mother's gentle voice broke his trance. "Jake, breakfast is ready," she called, her tone tired but tinged with determination. Jake could picture her in the kitchen, still wearing the worn cardigan she'd fallen asleep in after her late-night shift. "Coming, Mom," he replied, pulling on a tattered jacket that had seen one too many winters. His boots, frayed at the edges, waited by the door. The kitchen was small but cozy, with the faint aroma of toast and the hum of their old heater filling the air. His mom set a single boiled egg and a slice of toast in front of him, then handed over the snow shovel. "We're short this month," she said, smoothing back her auburn hair with a sigh. "If you can clear a few driveways, it'll make a difference." Jake nodded, swallowing both his toast and his frustration. He didn't resent the work, it was honest and necessary, but some mornings, he wished their life was easier. Other kids at school spent weekends playing games or hanging out at the mall. For Jake, weekends meant sore arms and cold fingers. "Be careful out there," his mom added, squeezing his shoulder. Her tired eyes softened with pride, even as she turned back to the sink full of dishes. "I will," Jake said, slipping on his boots and grabbing the shovel. Outside, the cold hit him like a wall, his breath curling in the air like wisps of smoke. He pushed through the ankle-deep snow, starting with Mrs. Parker's driveway, and then heading to the miller's. A few dollars here, a few there, it all added up, even if his muscles ached by the end of it. As he rounded the corner onto a quieter street, Jake's eyes caught on an older man at the end of a driveway. The man leaned heavily on a rusted shovel, his breath coming in uneven puffs. Each labored scoop of snow seemed to drain his energy, and the small patch he'd cleared was quickly being reclaimed by fresh flakes. Jake hesitated. He didn't recognize the man, and this wasn't a house he usually worked on. But something about the frailty in the man's movements and the stubborn determination in his posture made Jake pause. "Hey, Mr. Jake called, stepping closer. "Need a hand?" The man straightened slowly, clutching the shovel for balance. His face was deeply lined, the kind of weathered look that spoke of a long, hard life, but his bright blue eyes carried a spark of surprise and warmth. "Well, I won't say no to a strong young man like you," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. "I'm Henry, by the way." "I'm Jake," he replied, already sinking his shovel into the snow. "I'll take care of it for you." The driveway turned out to be longer than it looked, and the snow was packed tight, resisting Jake's efforts at every push. He worked steadily, his arms burning and his breath puffing in the frosty air. Henry stayed nearby, leaning against his shovel and offering words of encouragement. "You've got a good rhythm there," Henry remarked, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Reminds me of when I used to clear snow with my boy. Before he moved to the city, that is." Jake paused to catch his breath. "He doesn't live nearby anymore." Henry shook his head, the smile fading slightly. "Busy man. Big job in finance. He visits when he can." The words were casual, but Jake caught the wistfulness beneath them. By the time Jake finished, his arms felt like lead, and sweat dampened his back, despite the freezing air. He leaned on his shovel and surveyed his work. "All done." Henry's face lit up. "You've done a fine job, son. Let me get you something for your trouble." Reaching into his coat pocket, Henry pulled out a few crumpled bills. Jake glanced at them but shook his head firmly. "Keep it. I'm just glad I could help." Henry studied him for a moment, his eyes filled with a mix of surprise and admiration. "Not many kids these days would do that," he said. "Your parents must have raised you right." Jake shrugged, shifting his weight awkwardly. "My mom says we should help people when we can." Henry's expression softened. "She's a wise woman." As Jake turned to leave, Henry called after him. "Stop by any time, Jake. I wouldn't mind the company." Jake waved and continued down the street, his shovel slung over his shoulder. The cold still stung his cheeks, and his arms were sore, but his steps felt lighter. Something about Henry's gratitude and the warmth in his voice stayed with him, melting away the winter's chill. It wasn't just another driveway. It felt like the beginning of something far more important. A week later, the town was buried under another heavy snowfall. The storm had hit harder than usual, leaving cars stranded and sidewalks nearly invisible beneath towering drifts of snow. Jake bundled himself up against the biting cold and set out with his shovel, ready to tackle the usual driveways. After finishing at Mrs. Parker's, he paused at the corner of Henry's street. The older man's house came into view, and his driveway was piled high with fresh snow. Jake imagined Henry inside, probably staring out at the icy mess and wondering how he would manage. Without hesitation, Jake adjusted his scarf and trudged toward the familiar house. He knocked on the door, and a few moments later Henry appeared, wrapped in a thick cardigan over his flannel shirt. His face brightened as he recognized Jake. "Well, if it isn't my snow-clearing hero," Henry said with a chuckle. "I wasn't expecting you, but I'm mighty glad you're here." Jake grinned. "Figured you could use some help again." Henry stepped aside, motioning him inside. "Before you start, how about some hot chocolate? The good stuff, not the powder." Jake hesitated for a moment. The offer was unexpected but tempting. "Sure, I could use something warm." Henry's house was just as Jake remembered, cozy, with worn but comfortable furniture and shelves filled with old books. The scent of cedar lingered in the air, and a crackling fireplace cast a golden glow over the room. Jake noticed framed photos on the mantel: a younger Henry with a woman who must have been his wife, and a boy around Jake's age grinning proudly as he held up a wooden birdhouse. "Your son?" Jake asked, nodding toward the photo. Henry glanced over and smiled wistfully. "That's Brian. He built that birdhouse when he was about your age. It's still hanging in the backyard, though the birds don't use it much these days." As Henry busied himself in the kitchen, Jake walked over to the mantel, examining the photos more closely. There were pictures of Henry and Brian fishing, hiking, and building what looked like a treehouse. They looked happy, but something about the way Henry talked made Jake wonder how often they saw each other now. Henry returned with 2 steaming mugs, handing one to Jake before settling into an armchair. "You've got a good eye, noticing those photos. Brian was always a sharp kid, but his life got busier the older he got. I suppose that happens to everyone." Jake sipped his hot chocolate, feeling the warmth seep through him. "He doesn't visit much." Henry shook his head. "Work keeps him tied up in the city. We talk on the phone sometimes, but it's not the same as having him here. I miss the days when he'd just sit with me, even if we weren't doing anything." Jake nodded, not knowing what to say. His own mom worked long hours, but she always made time for him. He couldn't imagine what it would feel like to lose that connection. After they finished their drinks, Jake went outside to tackle the driveway. The snow was heavier than before, and his arms quickly began to ache, but he pushed through. Henry stood on the porch, bundled in a scarf and coat, calling out small jokes to keep Jake's spirits up. "You know," Henry said, his voice carrying over the scrape of the shovel, "you remind me of Brian when he was younger. Always ready to lend a hand, no matter how much work it was." Jake paused to catch his breath, leaning on his shovel. "What did he do when he was my age?" "Everything," Henry replied with a laugh. "Mowed lawns, fixed bikes, helped me with carpentry projects. He had a knack for building things, still does, though now it's more spreadsheets than wood." When Jake finally finished, Henry clapped his hands together in delight. "You're a marvel, Jake. I don't know how I'd manage without you." Jake smiled, his breath puffing in the cold air. "I'm glad I could help." Henry looked at him for a moment, his expression softening. "You know, if you're not too busy, you should stop by more often. I've got an old workshop in the garage that could use a second set of hands, and I wouldn't mind the company." Jake hesitated, then nodded. "I'll stop by. Just let me know what you need." Over the next few weeks, Jake kept his promise. Whenever he finished his snow-clearing rounds, he made his way to Henry's house. Together, they cleaned out the dusty workshop, repairing tools and sorting through piles of wood. Henry showed Jake how to sand a rough board until it was smooth enough to shine, how to measure cuts with precision, and how to assemble pieces with steady hands and patience. Their conversations grew deeper as they worked. Henry shared stories of his youth, how he met his wife, Mary, at a county fair, how they built their first house together, and how they raised Brian in the very home where Jake now stood. In turn, Jake talked about his own life. He told Henry about his mom's sacrifices, about his struggles at school, and about how much he wanted to go to college one day, even though it felt like an impossible dream. Henry listened intently, his weathered hands pausing over a wooden chair they were repairing. "Hard work and kindness can open doors you don't even see yet," he said. "I've learned that much in my time." Jake smiled, though he wasn't sure he fully believed it. Still, there was something about Henry's quiet confidence that made him want to try. One snowy afternoon, Jake arrived to find a sleek car parked in Henry's driveway. A man in a tailored coat stood by the porch, scrolling through his phone. Jake guessed immediately who it was. "You must be Jake," the man said, extending a hand as Jake approached. "I'm Brian. Dad's told me about you." Jake shook his hand, feeling the man's firm grip. "Nice to meet you." "Thanks for helping out around here," Brian said, glancing toward the house. "Dad talks about you like you're some kind of superhero." Jake shrugged, feeling self-conscious. "I just do what I can." Brian's polite smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He seemed distracted, like he was already thinking about his next appointment. "Well, I appreciate it. Dad's been happy lately. I think you've had something to do with that." Brian stayed only a short while, long enough to sit with Henry and catch up briefly before leaving again. As the car pulled away, Henry sighed, his breath visible in the cold air. "He's a good man," he said quietly. "Just stretched too thin." Jake didn't reply, but he couldn't help feeling that Henry deserved more than short visits and polite smiles. As he picked up his shovel to clear the driveway again, he made a silent promise to keep showing up for Henry, and maybe even for Brian, whether the man realized it or not. The snow fell softly around him, but Jake felt warm knowing he was exactly where he needed to be. The snowstorms continued as winter deepened, but Jake found himself looking forward to each trip to Henry's house. Their bond had grown from a simple act of kindness into something much more, friendship that felt like family. Jake wasn't just shoveling driveways anymore. He was spending afternoons in Henry's workshop, fixing small projects and learning skills he never thought he'd need. Henry's patience and expertise reminded Jake of his own grandfather, who had passed away when Jake was a child. Each time they completed a new project, whether it was a birdhouse or a repaired chair, Henry's pride shone through, and Jake felt like he was part of something meaningful. One afternoon, as Jake worked on sanding a piece of walnut for a picture frame, Henry brought up Brian. "He's been calling more often since you started coming around," Henry said, his voice thoughtful. "Says he's trying to make more time for family." "That's good," Jake replied, focusing on the smooth surface of the wood. "You deserve that." Henry smiled faintly. "He's got a big heart. Just buried under all those responsibilities, I think." A few days later, Brian arrived at Henry's house unannounced. Jake was helping Henry clean the gutters when Brian stepped out of his car, carrying a bag of groceries and a thermos of coffee. Jake climbed down the ladder, surprised. "Thought I'd drop by and check on Dad," Brian said, handing the bag to Henry. "Figured I could lend a hand for a change." Henry chuckled, setting the groceries down. "Well, this is a nice surprise." For the first time, Brian didn't seem like he was in a rush. He rolled up his sleeves and joined Jake in finishing the gutters, asking questions about their latest woodworking projects. Though his movements were clumsy compared to Jake's practiced efficiency, Brian worked hard, and Henry's laughter filled the air as he offered advice. Later, as they sat in the kitchen drinking the coffee Brian had brought, Henry leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile. "This reminds me of when you were little," he said to Brian. "You'd follow me around with that toy tool kit, fixing everything that didn't need fixing." Brian laughed, the sound more relaxed than Jake had ever heard. I guess I've gotten a little rusty since then. Jake watched the exchange quietly, feeling like an outsider in a moment that wasn't his. Yet, seeing Henry and Brian reconnect made him realize how much his own presence had contributed to this shift. He'd simply shown up and been there for Henry. But somehow it had opened a door for Brian to do the same. As winter gave way to the first hints of spring, Jake continued to spend time with Henry. Their workshop projects grew more ambitious, and Henry began teaching Jake not just the basics of woodworking but also the philosophy behind it. Every piece of wood has a story, Henry said one day as they inspected a raw plank. Your job is to listen to it. Find out what it wants to be. Jake wasn't sure if he understood at first, but the more he worked with Henry, the more it made sense. Each project wasn't just about crafting an object, it was about patience, attention, and care. It was about seeing potential where others might see scraps. One particularly sunny day, Henry called Jake into the backyard to show him something. In the corner, under a tall oak tree, stood an old picnic table, its wood warped and its paint peeling. This thing's seen better days, Henry said, patting the table. Mary and I built it when Brian was just a boy. It's where we had family dinners in the summer, played card games, and made plans. It's more than just a table, it's a piece of our history. Jake ran his hand over the surface, imagining the life that had been lived around it. You want to fix it up? I want us to fix it up, Henry said with a grin. You, me, and Brian. Think you can convince him to help? Jake nodded, already planning how to pitch the idea. He knew Brian was trying, even if he wasn't always sure how to navigate the growing closeness with his father. A project like this could be the perfect bridge. A week later, the three of them stood in the backyard, tools in hand, ready to begin. Brian looked slightly out of place in his polished boots and crisp shirt, but he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Together, they dismantled the table piece by piece, sanding down the boards and reinforcing the frame. Henry supervised, sharing stories about the table's past as they worked. By the time they finished, the table looked as good as new. Its smooth surface gleamed in the afternoon sun, and Henry ran his hand over it with pride. It's perfect, he said. I couldn't have done it without you boys. Brian stepped back, admiring their work. I can't remember the last time I did something like this, he admitted. It feels good. Jake smiled, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. The table wasn't just a project, it was a symbol of everything they had built together, both literally and figuratively. As they sat around the newly restored table, sharing lemonade and snacks that Brian had brought, Jake realized how far they'd all come since that first snowy day. Henry was happier and more energetic, Brian was finding his way back to his father, and Jake felt like he'd gained not just a mentor but a second family. The connection they had forged through simple acts of care and effort felt as sturdy as the table they now shared. It was a reminder that even the smallest actions could lead to something lasting and profound. As spring settled in and the snow became a memory, the days at Henry's house took on a new rhythm. Jake continued to visit regularly, helping with whatever projects Henry dreamed up, from crafting small birdhouses to repairing a creaky porch swing. Their conversations flowed easily now, filled with laughter and shared reflections on life. Brian's visits also became more frequent. Though he still juggled a demanding career, he seemed to prioritize his father in a way he hadn't before. Jake noticed the change in Brian's demeanor. He was more at ease, more present. Often, the three of them worked together in the garage or garden, their bond deepening with each shared task. One warm afternoon, Brian arrived with an unexpected gift, a sleek woodworking kit. The polished tools gleamed in the sunlight, and Jake stared at them in disbelief as Brian set the heavy case down on the workshop table. I've been meaning to bring this over, Brian said, brushing his hands off on his jeans. Dad tells me you've got a knack for this kind of thing. I figured you could use some proper tools. Jake looked up, stunned. I don't know what to say. This is incredible. Say you'll keep using them, Brian replied with a smile. From what Dad says, you've got real talent. And who knows? Maybe this will help you take it further." Henry beamed with pride, clapping a hand on Jake's shoulder. "You've earned it, Jake. You've got a good heart and good hands, two things this world always needs more of." Jake ran his fingers over the tools, his mind racing. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine the possibility of a future in woodworking, not just as a hobby, but as something more. The thought filled him with both excitement and apprehension. "Thank you," Jake finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't waste this, I promise." Brian nodded. "I'm sure you won't." The gift was just the beginning. As summer approached, Henry and Jake worked together to build a small collection of handmade items: picture frames, wooden trays, and intricately carved jewelry boxes. Henry insisted they try selling them at the local farmers market, and though Jake was hesitant at first, he eventually agreed. On the day of the market, they set up a simple booth under a pop-up tent. The wooden creations glinted in the sunlight, their polished surfaces catching the eyes of passers-by. Henry stood proudly beside Jake, greeting customers and sharing the stories behind each piece. To Jake's surprise, people loved their work. By the end of the day, they had sold nearly every item. As they packed up, Henry handed Jake the earnings, a small stack of bills that felt far heavier than its weight. "This is yours," Henry said firmly. "You did the work. You made this happen." Jake hesitated, looking down at the money. "I couldn't have done it without you." Henry chuckled. "You'll find that in life it's rarely about doing things alone. But you've got the drive, Jake. That's what counts." The success of their booth gave Jake a newfound confidence. Over the next few weeks, he began researching woodworking programs at local colleges, poring over brochures and websites with a determination that surprised even himself. When he told Henry and his mom about his plans, both of them were overjoyed. One evening, as Jake and Brian sat on the porch while Henry worked on a project in the garage, Brian turned to him. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "when I first heard about you helping Dad, I felt embarrassed. Like I should have been the one doing all those things." Jake glanced over, unsure how to respond. But Brian continued, "I realized something important. You didn't just help Dad. You reminded me of what I was missing. You gave me a chance to fix things before it was too late." Jake shifted uncomfortably, not used to such direct praise. "I just showed up. That's all." "Showing up is everything," Brian said, his gaze steady. "Never forget that." In the following weeks, Brian's visits became even more consistent. He began taking over some of the responsibilities Jake had handled, from fixing minor repairs to helping Henry with grocery runs. It freed Jake to focus on preparing for college, though he still visited Henry whenever he could. As the seasons turned, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed. What had started as a simple decision to help a struggling man with his driveway had grown into something extraordinary. He had gained a mentor in Henry, a friend in Brian, and a clearer vision of his future. But more than that, he had witnessed the transformative power of connection, how one act of kindness could ripple outward, healing wounds and bringing people closer. One warm summer evening, Henry invited Jake and his mom over for dinner. They sat around the restored picnic table in the backyard, sharing stories and laughter as the sun dipped below the horizon. Brian joined them, bringing a homemade dessert he had learned to make from one of Henry's old recipes. As the stars began to appear, Henry raised his glass. To Jake, he said, his voice filled with emotion, "For showing up when it mattered most, and for reminding us all of what really matters." Jake's cheeks flushed, but he raised his glass, smiling. "To all of us," he said. "For everything we've built together." The toast was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they had shared: the struggles, the triumphs, and the quiet moments of understanding. And as they sat under the stars, surrounded by warmth and laughter, Jake felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that no matter where life took him, the lessons he had learned here would stay with him forever. As the summer unfolded, Jake's life brimmed with purpose and connection. Days at Henry's house remained a constant in his routine, even as he prepared for college. The small victories, like selling handcrafted items at the farmer's market, fueled his confidence, and the encouragement he received from Henry and Brian became a steady source of strength. One late afternoon, as Jake and Henry were putting the finishing touches on a new project, Brian arrived with an announcement. He carried a large envelope and handed it to his father with a sheepish grin. "What's this?" Henry asked, peering at the envelope. "It's from the city," Brian said. "I submitted some of our woodworking projects to a local exhibit for artisans. They loved the story behind them, how you and Jake built them together, and they want to showcase them." Henry's eyes widened, and he chuckled in disbelief. "You're telling me our little workshop pieces are museum material?" "It's not a museum," Brian clarified. "It's a community gallery. But they're excited about the craftsmanship and the story. It's good exposure, and I thought it might mean something to both of you." Jake felt his heart race. The idea of their work being displayed was overwhelming, but the excitement in Brian's voice gave him courage. "That's incredible," Jake said. "We should do it, Henry." Henry looked from Brian to Jake, his face softening into a proud smile. "All right then, let's show them what we've got." Over the next few weeks, Jake and Henry worked tirelessly to prepare their best pieces for the exhibit. The garage-turned-workshop buzzed with activity as they polished old creations and crafted new ones. Brian joined them in the evenings, lending a hand and taking on tasks with growing confidence. The bond between father and son deepened with each passing day, and Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment watching their relationship mend. On the night of the exhibit, the gallery was filled with warm light and quiet chatter. People wandered from piece to piece, admiring the intricate details and careful craftsmanship of each item. A small placard near the display told the story of how Jake and Henry had met during a snowstorm, and how their friendship had blossomed into a shared passion. Jake stood off to the side, feeling both proud and nervous as he watched attendees linger by the display. Henry joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Look at that," Henry said, nodding toward the crowd. "You've made something that people appreciate, Jake. Something real." Jake smiled. "We made it together." As the evening progressed, more visitors stopped to admire their work. One couple expressed interest in commissioning a custom table, while another asked if Jake had plans to start his own business. The positive feedback was overwhelming, and by the end of the night, Jake's mind buzzed with possibilities. Afterward, the three of them, Henry, Brian, and Jake, went out for a quiet celebration. Over dinner, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "None of this would have happened if Jake hadn't shown up that day," Henry said, raising his glass. He turned a snowstorm into a blessing. Jake shook his head modestly. "I just wanted to help." "And you did," Brian said, meeting Jake's gaze. "More than you know. You didn't just help Dad, you reminded me what I was missing. I can't thank you enough for that." Jake's heart swelled with gratitude. He thought about his mom, who had taught him the value of kindness and hard work. He thought about Henry, who had shown him the power of mentorship and patience. And he thought about Brian, who had opened a door to opportunities Jake had never imagined. As summer faded into autumn, Jake started his first semester at community college. Though his schedule was packed with classes and part-time work, he still found time to visit Henry. They continued their projects, each one a reminder of how far they'd come. One crisp October morning, Jake arrived at Henry's house to find Brian already there. The two of them were sitting on the porch, sipping coffee and laughing about something Jake couldn't hear. It was a scene that filled Jake with quiet satisfaction, a testament to the lasting impact of their shared journey. Henry waved him over, his face lighting up. "Come on, Jake. We were just talking about the next project." Jake joined them, settling into a chair as the sun rose higher in the sky. The air was cool and crisp, and the trees surrounding the yard were ablaze with red and gold. It was a moment of perfect contentment, a reminder that even the simplest things could hold the greatest beauty. What had started as a small act of kindness had grown into a chain of connections between Jake and Henry, between Henry and Brian, and even between Jake and his own future. And though the snow that had brought them together was long gone, the bonds they had forged would remain strong, carrying them through every season ahead.